Well, welcome everyone to this joint meeting of the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs with our colleagues in the House Judiciary Committee who are up in their committee room joining us via Zoom. Thank you, Chair Lalonde, for working in tandem with us today. First thing I want to do is go around and since we have a number of folks here from various agencies and folks watching to just quickly introduce each of the members of the committees that are here. I'm Representative Mike McCarthy from St. Albans, and I chair the House Government Operations and Military Affairs Committee. I'll turn it over to Vice Chair.
Thank you. Representative Matt Byron, Addison 3 District. I reside in Virgins and represent 5 other municipalities in that area.
Representative Lucy Boyden. I represent District Lamoille 3, which is Cambridge and Waterville, and this is my first term.
Representative Lisa Hango, Franklin 5, which is 4 towns on the northern border, Berkshire, Richford, Franklin, and Highgate.
Michael Morgan, represent Olive Grandisle County and the western corner of Milton, 2nd term.
Good morning, Mike Berwicki from the Wyndham 4 District of Putney and Dummerston in the southeast part of the park.
Seth Chase, Colchester.
Shay Waters Evans from Charlotte and a bit of Heinsberg.
Kate Nugent, newly elected person of South Burlington.
Great. And Representative Higley, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Representative Mark Higley from Lowell. I represent the Orleans Lamoille District, which is Lowell, Jay, Westfield, Troy, the towns of Eden, Irisburg, Coventry, and Newport Town. It's a 2-seat district.
Representative Lalonde, do you want to go around your table and then I'll have my couple of folks who are just getting seated?
Perfect. Yes, and we have a quorum now too. So Martin Lalonde, Chair of the House Judiciary, and one of 5 representatives from South Burlington.
Tom Burdett, Vice Chair of House Judiciary, and I represent West Rutland, Clarendon, Wallingford, and Rutland Town.
Karen Dolan, and I'm one of the representatives from Essex Junction.
Ella Chapin, I represent East Montpelier and Middlesex.
Tom Oliver, represent Swanton and Sheldon.
Ken Goslant, represent Northfield and Berlin.
That's all of us for now.
Great. And Representative Hooper of Burlington, would you like to introduce yourself?
Apologize, Mr. Chair. Our caucus ran a little long this morning.
Hooper caucus.
Hooper caucus. Nice cover, Bob. Bob Hooper, Burlington.
And Representative Hooper of Randolph.
Jay Hooper, Brookfield, Braintree, Randolph, Granville, and Roxbury. Pardon me.
And in case you missed it, we have 3 mics and 2 Hoopers on House Gov.Ops and Military Affairs, so it can get a little confusing around here. So before we start with our first witness, and we're going to take about 3 hours of testimony today, most likely, and we'll take a break in the middle. I just want to take a quick minute to frame why we're taking testimony today about the role and responsibilities of the Office of Sheriff in Vermont, and acknowledge the context of the national conversation in regard to law enforcement. Over the weekend, pretty horrifying videos were released that show a 29-year-old Memphis man, Tyree Nichols, pepper sprayed, running away in fear, and then being brutally beaten to death by police. This is just the latest in a series of Black Americans killed by police, incidents that we've seen because of the prevalence of body cameras, cell phones, and other footage. Many of us keep asking why George Floyd had to die this way, why Breonna Taylor was shot in her home, why Philando Castile and so many others were killed by police, people who should be alive today. It would be easy and a comfort to say that Vermont is different, that we're immune and we don't have the same problems with excessive use of force, racial and class disparities, or corruption here in our rural state. Unfortunately, in my own community of St. Albans, a series of incidents, the most egregious being a St. Albans Police Department officer who punched a detained woman, it exposed a need for more community oversight. And we established a police advisory board, a belonging, equity, and inclusion committee. We got new leadership and officers, and we focused on new use of force, incident reporting, and other policies that have shown me that law enforcement agencies with systemic problems can change. I'm proud that I was able to see my community take action in the face of bad headlines and public outcry and transform our police department. That work is not done. Last August, just after the primary election, video was released that showed a man in the custody of the Franklin County Sheriff's Office kicked repeatedly by the sole candidate for sheriff who appeared on the ballot, Captain John Grismore. Mr. Grismore was terminated from the Franklin County Sheriff's Office. However, after facing a write-in challenge, being charged with simple assault, and being called to step aside by both the Democratic and Republican county committees, he will be sworn in today as the new Franklin County Sheriff. Our constituents look at this and other headline-grabbing incidents like embezzlement, corruption, and abuse of the public trust in several counties and are dismayed. Today, we will hear about the Office of Sheriff. We'll hear from sheriffs who I respect and value for their leadership and their commitment to making the office what it should be. We will hear from state's attorneys and court administrators who rely on sheriffs and their deputies. We'll hear from a high bailiff who had to assume the office of sheriff. We'll hear about questionable financial practices that have been uncovered by our state auditor, and not one, but at least 2 county sheriff's offices recently. I deeply value and respect those who take an oath to serve our communities and our state, who faithfully protect public safety. We are not here today to tear down law enforcement. We need to support good policing, but we have to understand what is going on with the Office of Sheriff, what systemic issues can be addressed, and what powers and duties the General Assembly has to address them. We have many excellent law enforcement leaders as elected sheriffs in Vermont, but as we consider a bill and a constitutional amendment over the coming months, I'd ask all of us to consider if we need more accountability, professional qualifications, and basic transparency so that we are not so reliant on and subject to the personal character of whoever happens to be elected sheriff every 4 years. So with that, I would like to welcome our first witnesses, Legislative Counsel, who will talk about the way the Constitution constructs the office of sheriff and tell us a little bit more about our powers in relation to that office. So thank you, Ben and Tim, for being here this morning.
Thank you very much, Chair McCarthy. For the record, my name is Tim Devlin, Legislative Counsel. We've been asked to provide some remarks on the constitutional and statutory framework for the roles and responsibilities of Vermont sheriffs. I will speak to these items insofar as they fall within the jurisdiction of this House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. My colleague, Attorney Ben Novogrodsky, will speak to what falls within the jurisdiction of the Judiciary Committee for the most part. As I have previously said to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs, it is in that committee's jurisdiction to consider matters relating to the administration of public safety. That is the practical functioning of the state law enforcement apparatus, including the departments, the interplay, and the aspects of being a law enforcement officer as a profession. This administration of public safety should be understood as distinct and apart from matters pertaining to the public's civil liberties, which often come up in discussion of policing, but are more so in the jurisdiction of the House Judiciary Committee. Various aspects of the roles and responsibilities of the Vermont sheriffs are found in both the Vermont Constitution and the Vermont Statutes Annotated, the VSA. Put simply, the Constitution controls the qualifications for sheriffs and how they enter and exit into office, while the statutes largely entail the structure and funding of sheriff's departments and the duties performed by the sheriffs. The Constitution states elections and bonding requirements for entrance into office. I should note that the enumerated qualifications for office of sheriff, that is elections and bonding, are exclusive qualifications, meaning that altering qualifications for office would require a constitutional amendment. The Constitution requires the removal of a sheriff from office to be by impeachment. Impeachment is also exclusive as a remedy, meaning that this is the only means of removal without a constitutional amendment. I will now turn to the statutes, which describe the administration of public safety as they relate to sheriffs. Structurally, Title 24 VSA, Section 290A, establishes a sheriff's department in each county. The various sources of sheriff department funding are described in Titles 24, specifically Chapter 5, County Officers' Powers and Duties, and also in different parts of Title 32, Taxation and Finances. These sources of funding include state funds appropriated for all of the Vermont state's attorneys and sheriffs, portions of annual county budgets, sheriff salaries, fees for civil process, transportation, and care of prisoners, juveniles, and disabled persons, and funds from sheriff's supplementary contracts to provide law enforcement and other related services. Title 24, Chapter 5 also requires sheriff's departments to follow accounting procedures set by the state auditor. Now I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you, Tim. My name is Ben Novogrosky from the Office of Legislative Counsel. As my colleague Tim, our attorney Tim Devlin mentioned, I'll talk about more of the judiciary-related aspects of sheriffs, but inevitably there is a little bit of crossover between the two areas. So, for instance, with sheriffs, the purview of the House Judiciary Committee would be that of the performance of their law enforcement duties and sort of consequences that may result, or the examination of those duties as well. So that would involve investigations, interrogations, potential lawsuits, and what those look like. So for instance, right now in the Senate Judiciary Committee, they're dealing with a bill S6 that talks about juvenile interrogations and what law enforcement officers can and cannot do in those situations. So that is a more sort of judiciary related topic. However, part of what goes into the interrogation of any suspect is the training that law enforcement officers, which include sheriffs, involve. So for instance, there are various statutes that describe sheriff responsibilities, and they can probably be put into four broad categories. One, duties that are prescribed to sheriffs by particular statutes in Title 24, Chapter 5. So these duties involve transporting prisoners, serving and executing lawful writs, warrants, and service of process, and quote unquote preserving the peace. A second category would be duties of a sheriff as a law enforcement officer. So this includes sheriffs in those duties, but also municipal police officers, state police officers. They're all subject to these set of duties as well. And the underpinnings of these duties can be found in federal, state statutes, and also our court cases, common law. Third, there's the training and certification of sheriffs and all law enforcement officers that is administered by the Vermont Criminal Justice Council. Those statutes and controlling provisions are found in Title 20, Chapter 151. Subchapter 1 of that describes the trainings and certification levels. So for instance, sheriffs, like all law enforcement officers, can obtain three certification levels. Level 1 is the lowest level, so it involves security, transport, vehicle escorts, and traffic control, and other techniques based on circumstances. Level 2 certification is everything of level 1. But they can respond to crimes in progress and investigations of crimes involving the mistreatment of animals, arson, disorderly conduct, violations of abuse prevention orders, drug possession, motor vehicle violations, and others. And then level 3 is the highest level of authority, which gives full law enforcement authority to anybody that is trained and certified as a level 3 officer. Some of the training that's dictated by statute is anti-bias training, domestic violence training, animal cruelty training, and fair and impartial policing training. And there are also various statewide policies that sheriffs, like all law enforcement officers, are subject to, which include the fair and impartial policing policy of the state, race data collection policies. So for instance, every time that there is someone's pulled over, there's certain data that needs to be collected about the driver. Electronic control devices, GPS monitoring, there's a statewide policy, the statewide use of force policy, and then the usage of body cameras. So those are the training and certification levels, but then there's also in subchapter 2, unprofessional conduct statutes that govern sheriffs. So this includes requirements for sheriff's departments to adopt internal affairs policies in line with the Vermont Criminal Justice Council, but also empowers the departments themselves to investigate various misconduct, and then, depending on the situation, refer those investigations to the council. So there are various levels of misconduct that can fall under this statute. So category A conduct or misconduct includes felonies, that are committed on or off duty, misdemeanors committed on duty, and others committed off duty like assault, domestic violence, solicitation, and other similar misdemeanors. Category B misconduct includes gross professional misconduct or the willful failure to comply with state policies or substantial deviation from those, from an agency's policies. Or if there's no policy that's covering the specific misconduct, if it includes sexual harassment, misuse of the official position, excessive force, bias enforcement, use of a chokehold, which would be against statewide policy, or interference of investigations. Those are other bases that fall under a more stringent level of discipline that can be associated with that conduct. And then category C really includes misconduct related to council procedures. And then ultimately the sanctions, and this is, mind you, limited to their law enforcement certification itself. So this would apply to sheriffs in the sense that their law enforcement powers can be subject to a written warning by the council, to suspension, to revocation with the option of recertification depending on the council's discretion, or permanent revocation. So those are all the various forms of trainings and disciplines that sheriffs are subject to, in addition to those mandated by federal and common law.
Okay, so I want to ask a couple of clarifying questions. Turn it over to each of the committee. So, Tim, you had said that altering the qualifications would require a constitutional amendment. So if I'm understanding your description and Ben's description of the relationship between the law enforcement certification that the Vermont Criminal Justice Council is in charge of, even if a sheriff has their certification suspended or they're fully decertified because of misconduct, they are still the sheriff. They just can't perform the investigative law enforcement duties. Am I a correct understanding?
Yes, that is correct.
And do we have the power to, say, for instance, require that a sheriff be a certified law enforcement officer in order to conduct the duties and hold the office?
As a qualification for office, doing such would require a constitutional amendment.
Short of impeachment that you mentioned as the only remedy for removal, are there any other ways that somebody who's an elected sheriff that, is found guilty of a crime, is decertified, is there any other way to remove them from office?
No, the impeachment as a means of removal from office is an exclusive remedy. And modifying that or introducing a new means for removal from office would require a constitutional amendment.
And is this unique to sheriffs in law enforcement leadership in the state of Vermont? For instance, the chief of police works for the city council in St. Albans. If the chief of police, if he's hired, he can be terminated for misconduct. He's subject to that body's political decision-making. Is there any other executive law enforcement officer where the only way they can be removed from office is impeachment in Vermont?
I think a state's attorney would probably be the only other. But yeah, it's unique to sheriffs as far as ones that are acting in a purely law enforcement role. You mentioned police chiefs and municipal police officers. By statute, they're governed by a legislative body of the municipality or, the town manager, however it's set up. So yeah, sheriffs are unique in that sense.
The only thing I would add to that is because they're an elected official, really. That's, I think, the qualifying difference between most other law enforcement executives and sheriffs.
And my colleague Tim can actually probably elaborate a little bit more on this, but it's really fascinating in the sense that sheriffs, the history behind a sheriff versus that of a police officer. I mean, sheriffs really come from, England, And, you know, really when you think of like Robin Hood and the Sheriff of Nottingham, I mean, it's really this old position that exists that has sort of come literally across the ocean and is now being implemented here. And so it's because of sort of the history behind it that you can probably speculate and say, well, that's why sheriffs are unique comparatively to other law enforcement officers.
Representative Chase and then Representative Higley, I see your hand up, so we'll go with Representative Chase first.
Quick follow-up. If a sheriff was convicted of a crime and in prison and refused to step down, they could still theoretically be a sheriff while in prison?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Higley.
Yes, thank you. Question I have, I guess, under that exclusive remedy of impeachment, what would that look like? What does an impeachment process look like?
That's something that's currently being looked into by legislative council as far as what the actual procedure is. It's been quite some time that it's been done in Vermont. But on a broad level, it would be something conducted in the House of Representatives, where the Senate would essentially sit as a jury or similar entity like that. But as far as the specific procedures and the details of impeachment, that's something that's still being researched right now.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Byron.
Thank you. Okay, so sheriffs are a unique role, but sheriffs are not unique to Vermont. How do they deal with this in other states as far as oversight and accountability?
That's a good question, and one that, from my perspective, I'd probably have to look into a bit more. Sheriffs are, just knowing about Vermont law itself, sheriffs are usually, in other jurisdictions, county-based officers. The Vermont county structure is unique comparatively to other states like New York or Florida, larger states that have much more infrastructure at the county level. While I'd have to do research, I'd speculate that there are differences between what's done in Vermont and other states, but I couldn't tell you exactly what those differences are at the moment.
So there are a couple of questions in House Judiciary, I think, and then we'll come back.
Yeah, I have one. Thank you. I'm just wondering if the people of a county could call for a special election to remove a sheriff.
Recall is I kind of returning to this remedy. Recalls would not really be permitted in this circumstance for removing somebody from office. It would have to be either by natural expiration of term, if they opted not to run again, or resignation, or maybe the closer to political solutions there. But I'd have to reiterate, rather than a recall, it would really have to come down to impeachment as the means to remove somebody from office.
Just a couple other quick questions, I think. So is where in the Constitution, is it just Section 43 that relates to sheriffs, or is there someplace else that I'm missing?
Sure. There are a few references to sheriffs throughout the Constitution. Let's see, language pertaining to the election of sheriffs appears in Chapter 2, Section 50. And that states that sheriffs are elected every 4 years by the voters of the respective districts as established by law. There's additional election information or language insofar as the sheriffs are elected at the general elections. That's in Chapter 2, Section 43, which I think you just mentioned. Let's see, the manner and certification of election and filling of vacancies in the office of sheriff shall be established by law. That's in Chapter 2, Section 53. And then in Chapter 2, Section 25, sheriffs before entering upon the duties of their offices shall be given sufficient security in such manner and in such sums as shall be determined by the legislature. So that's the bonding requirement, which I think is $100,000. I'd have to check. That's what I recall.
So another question, state's attorneys, to be elected, they don't have to be a licensed lawyer, is that correct?
I don't know that off the top of my head. It would be counterintuitive, but I believe that suspicion is correct, but I'd have to do some more research just to confirm that for you, Chair Lalonde.
Yeah, it's just that, I mean, if we're able to have that requirement of being a licensed attorney, I don't understand why we couldn't require a sheriff to be certified law enforcement, but you're probably right as far as that not being a requirement, but if you could just double check that, that'd be helpful. Karen Dolan has a question as well.
Yes, and I think you already shared this, but I'm hoping you can just clarify for me. I appreciate this overview of sheriff's roles and responsibilities. And so it seems like there's one piece of oversight if somebody is certified as law enforcement. If they do something against that, they can be decertified and so are no longer law enforcement. So I get that piece of it. If you could summarize, what are the duties outside of law enforcement? So say a sheriff has been decertified in law enforcement, what are they able to do still?
Sure. As far as we understand it, they largely fall to remaining administrative duties. As far as care for the sheriff's department, as it exists for namely administrative and personnel.
Hiring and firing and.
Okay, so law enforcement is the main role.
So could I just ask, as a follow-up to Representative Dolan's question, a sheriff who was decertified, went through the misconduct process, either had their certification suspended or taken away from by the Vermont Criminal Justice Council, would still be able to control the budget. They'd still be able to hire and fire deputies. They would still have all the administrative authority of the office. They just wouldn't be able to perform the law enforcement duties.
That's correct. The only thing that might be at least shared is budgetary, because assistant judges, at least from a county level, are the ones that administer the county budget. But as far as the sheriff's department itself, yes.
All right, so I have a couple of quick questions here, and then I do want to move on because we have a number of witnesses in the room, and this will not be the last time that I think we have legislative counsel in, because we'll be, I believe, hearing a bill before too long. Representative Hooper, and then Representative Hango. Sorry, I didn't mean to skip you.
I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, but what if every town in a county were to draft articles of impeachment for a town meeting day? To ask the question to the voters of every town.
Well, I think that's a good question, but as far as, and to ask you a question in return, would it just be to actually draft the articles of impeachment itself, or like sort of the towns expressing approval that yes, they should go forward with articles of impeachment, or actually drafting the articles themselves to be voted on?
So each individual town confronts the identical question of whether or not to keep or throw out the sitting sheriff. And then, well, I guess.
Well, and
I mean, would every town have to agree on a certain, would every town have to vote yes, throw them out, or?
There isn't any provision that would allow towns to do that at all, right? We have no recall.
What if that did happen though?
I think it would be largely symbolic, of the towns sort of expressing their will, but ultimately it wouldn't have a practical effect on the sheriff's position.
Sure. Representative Hango.
Thank you. First, let me address Representative Hooper. Nice idea, but it's too late because the warnings have already gone to the printers for town meeting day. So if you were to have something like that on the ballot, on the warning, it's too late to do that. So the question I had, and it's not really a question, going back to follow up on Representative Byrong's statement or question earlier, I would really like to know what other states that do not have county government do in a situation where they are faced with an official who is in this position, and they would like to discipline or remove that person from office. So, clearly we do not have county government in Vermont for all rights and purposes. So I'm sure there are other states that are in similar positions and maybe have faced this in the past. So rather than us inventing the wheel, maybe we can figure out. So do you have access to that type of information that you could get that to us?
We do, and I would just say that I think a lot of it, as far as process, may be, informative of what could be done here, but ultimately, Vermont is bound by its constitution and the sheriff's status as a constitutional officer. So while there might be some authority out there that could inform a process, ultimately its application is maybe excluded based off of what's unique to Vermont.
Good, that's all good information, and I think that will help us if and when we have to deal with the constitutional issue, because apparently there is a constitutional amendment coming to us. Thanks.
Representative Hooper.
Just to put a bow on Jay's question, Representative Hooper's. Impeachment is the only mechanism and the only body effectively empowered to do the impeachment is the one we're sitting in. So everything else is off the table at this point.
For removal from office.
Short of a resignation or the termination of the person's term. Representative Nugent.
Is there any way to change the term, like the number of years that they serve? Or how would you try to?
The term is written into the Constitution. So to change that would require an amendment.
All right. Representative Hooper, then I'm going to give our colleagues in House Judiciary a last chance, and then I'd like to move on to some of our witnesses who I think may.
Well, I don't want to harp on this silly idea that Hango's just squashed, but I do want to harp on it. There are only two ways to put an article on the ballot for town meeting day, correct? One, select board simply drafts and adopts the question, or two, 5% of under voters of the town to get a petition to do the same. Is there any other way for, like, let's say the state to put a question on the ballot for town meeting day for counties or towns?
Towns can nominate things from the floor, right?
So I think another way to answer this question and to get at this is the provisions in the Constitution. They say the sheriffs are elected in their districts, and while I think we're going to hear from other folks who are testifying today about the sheriff's contracts as providing law enforcement services for towns, that might be something where the town could take action and say, we no longer, want to have the sheriff have the law enforcement contract for highway patrol or other law enforcement services, right? So towns could definitely have the power to do that, but that removal of that contract or termination of that contract it wouldn't remove that person from office as a sheriff.
I'd agree with that summary.
Is that the distinction that we're getting at, Representative Hooper?
I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, are there ways to put the question to the towns and the voters before we would take legislative action so as to confirm the outcome that is preferred by voters?
I think it's, the towns could certainly have non-binding resolutions that could signal the voting populations, preference on some issue. However, procedurally, I think that impeachment would start in the House, and so it'd be up to its members, leadership, other things of that nature. House rules, procedures there to actually initiate the process, which I think would be distinct from any sort of municipal signaling.
And start to finish, how fast does it, how long is the impeachment process?
I don't know.
There hasn't been one since the 1970s, so it's good question, right?
1917.
Well, there was not a successful impeachment, but there were articles of impeachment adopted, and there was a trial in the Senate in the 1970s, and it happened to be a sheriff from Washington County, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, it did not. The sheriff was not impeached in that case, but the articles of impeachment were passed by the House, but the Senate did not convict, if I understand my history correctly.
Yeah, and I think it would just depend on, the articles of impeachment, what's contained in them, and then, what it takes to essentially prove them one way or the other. So like litigation, it's hard to really know how long it would take, especially in a process that's more esoteric than litigation is.
Okay, so I want to move on. So Representative Hango, I'll let you have the last word in here, and then I want to jump over to judiciary and we'll.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I have another question going back to the duties of a sheriff. If they were decertified and they were still performing administrative tasks, so would they be able to oversee criminal investigations if they were in that position?
I would say probably not. And it depends what you mean by overseeing a criminal investigation. I mean, if they're making sort of broad decisions on, a discretion of which way an investigation should go, I mean, that's in my view, performing law enforcement duties, so they would not be allowed to do that. If it's whether or not, you hiring or the pay of someone that would be in charge of that investigation, sure. But the investigation itself is a law enforcement duty.
Yeah, the investigation itself. So really, they would be strictly limited to things like hiring and approving timesheets, real administrative duties only. And they'd still be getting paid their salary from whatever they would have made if they hadn't been decertified.
I think there's a slight reduction.
Okay.
5 or 10%.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Lalonde, anybody in your room have any other questions?
I don't see any other questions here. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you, Tim and Ben. Next up, John Campbell and Annie Noonan. Are you going to be testifying together? Would you like to come up together? Yeah. Come on.
Chair McCarthy, would you like us to stand by or?
I don't think that's necessary unless you would like to hear some of the flavor of questions that are being asked, because I have a feeling we'll be hearing a bill coming from the Senate, potential constitutional amendment. We may have other things that will be related to this in terms of there's a Vermont Criminal Justice Council housekeeping bill that may have some pieces that are related to this. So if you find it useful to stay, I welcome you to do that. But I know we're in a intense drafting season, so I want to give you the discretion to get out of here and work on other bills.
Just watch via Zoom.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, gentlemen. So John Campbell is the Executive Director of the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, along with Annie Noonan, Relations and Operations Manager. I really appreciate both of you coming in to tell us a little bit about the role of your office and help us understand how it works a little better.
Thank you. For the record, John Campbell, Executive Director for the State's Attorneys and Sheriffs.
Annie Noonan, Labor Relations and Operations Manager, Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs.
I have the title, she does all the work. First of all, thank you very much for having us here. We've obviously have been before a couple of committees regarding issues that unfortunately have come to light throughout the state. And I think it's important, and what we'll do is I'll go through, just explain how the department came to be, and then Annie can take over to explain the financial operations and what exactly the relationship is with the certain portions of the sheriff's departments. Back in the 70s, when there was a time when because they're both county government, both the state's attorneys and the sheriffs would come here to Montpelier to request a budget for each year. And so finally, the Appropriations Committee said, wait, this just doesn't make sense for us doing 28 budgets. Why don't we establish the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, and they will be, in essence, the financial pass-through and they'll come up and present the budget to both, to the legislature, both the House and the Senate. So that's why that was formed, and we each year come before the legislature and request a budget for the state's attorneys for their total operations. However, for the sheriffs, the only thing that we really do that involves the sheriffs is their salaries and their benefits flow through our department. And then we also have the state paid deputies, which are the ones that do the transportations for those who are incarcerated or for mental illness or for juveniles. And however, the day-to-day operations of sheriffs, their contracts, any other activity is solely within their purview. And we're not involved in it, and we're not able to really oversee it. Last year, in fact, actually up until last year, it was even difficult with the transport deputies for us to say what they could and couldn't do because they came under the sheriff. So some sheriffs, if they were transporting, their number one job was transporting transporting prisoners, but some sheriffs had used them also for other duties, whether it be law enforcement or if they weren't doing anything else, some of them had used them on contracts. So then the legislature last year fortunately gave us more authorization that we are now able to tell the transport deputies what type of jobs they can do and what they can't. So at this point, we are still down to the point of really having no oversight with the sheriffs and just now limited oversight with the transport deputies. I'm going to let Annie take it over from here, but I would like to, at the end, I'll make a general comment, and also just to let you know to the question with the state's attorney that you won't find it really in statute where they have to be an attorney, but it's sort of implicit under one of the statutes about attorneys and prosecuting cases, because if he goes into court and also under the professional rules of conduct, if an attorney is there, they would have to be a licensed attorney to appear in court in that position. There's also a question if the state's attorney was not a licensed attorney but had deputies who were, could that happen? Could they work that way? That is that if you had our professional rules of conduct as attorneys say that you cannot supervise, a non-attorney cannot be supervising a licensed attorney. So I think there would be difficulty there. So with that said, Mr. Chairman, if I could turn it over to Annie, please.
Thank you. Good morning. Nice to meet some of you for the first time and see some old friends here. So as John said, our agency takes the money for the sheriffs for their salary and benefits and for the state transport deputies. Under the statute, what it says that we do is we provide administrative and budgetary oversight and structure for the transportation work and extradition work that's done by the state transport deputies. As you know, there's 14 sheriffs. There are about 20 state transport deputies. They're state employees. Their salaries are from the general fund. They have state health insurance, state retirement. They're in Group C, most of them. Some of the older people are still in an old Group F, but most of them mirror everything with state employees. As you might remember, for those of you who were here last year, the legislature passed a bill allowing the state transport deputies to unionize under VSEA. The department supported that effort, and they are not yet, we have not yet started negotiations. VSEA just let us know that they're ready. So those folks will be at some point working with VSEA as their collective bargaining agent. All of our state transport deputies are currently certified as level 2 or level 3 by the Vermont Criminal Justice Training Council. We have, I believe, only 2 people who are level 2 and all the rest are level 3. How that helps in the work of the transport deputies is it allows them, if they have to pick up a prisoner at a federal facility, they have to be level 3 to transport them back, federal prisoners. So in addition to that, though, the statute was written in a way that said that their primary work is the transportation of I believe the term says, prisoners, persons with mental health issues, juveniles. So that's a lot of the work that they do, but they also are engaged in civil process, which is basically an administrative serving of papers. And it also says that they can do general law enforcement duties. So I know over the years there's been questions about, so what happens if in a county there's not a transport available that day? There's nobody's looking for somebody to come to court, which does sometimes happen if the court has a day of training or some other thing that the courts engage in. They are allowed to do general law enforcement duties. We ask the sheriffs, because they are state employees, to make sure that they're working with us so that we know what those duties are doing. Of course, they cannot work on a private contract where, because on those days, they would be serving on our dime, so to speak. They're being paid by the state, so then they can't go charge Pike if they're running a blue light on the interstate for a construction project, right? Because that's a different pot of money. So we're very careful. We work with the sheriffs very carefully to make sure that we know and that they know. But really what I think should be of interest to the committee here is how much work the sheriffs, transport deputies, our folks, do, and the sheriff's own deputies do in support of the infrastructure of public safety and law enforcement in the state of Vermont. So I'll just first talk about our folks and the kind of things that they do. So of course they are assigned to the transport of folks, but they also serve as security in the courts. So if they're standing in the courtroom, they are in the courtroom the whole time that they have somebody who is in there for a hearing, and they are basically additional security in the courtroom because they're law enforcement folks. But that in addition to that, if they're not doing transports that day, we allow them to go actually to the courthouses to back up security, work, getting people in. If there's a jury day, there could be 70 people coming through that need to be screened. We allow them to assist the judiciary regularly with court security. So for example, our Addison County sheriff, because we don't have a lot of transports in that corridor right there, because although he backs up the Rutland sheriff a fair amount, he has been providing court security to the Addison County Court for months and months and months. So we back up other state agencies. So it's not just what they do. DOC uses us. DOC, as you might know, that during the period of time where there were remote hearings, so you pick somebody up at a facility, you bring them up to Springfield, for example, say from Brattleboro to Springfield, and they'd be cited to appear at a later date. Now they're released. How do they get back from Springfield to Brattleboro? There's not a bus running down the interstate. So what we did is we developed a program in connection with the court and DOC that said, as long as they are willing to stay in our custody until we get them back to Brattleboro, we'll give them a ride back to the home area, not to their home, but to Brattleboro, where they, where they're from. That really was a big issue particularly during the pandemic, because so many things were remote. So we call it post-release arraignment program. So we're doing that with DOC. We also get requests from DOC on occasion. As you know, that DOC is really understaffed. We get requests for helping to move people from facility to facility. And if we're available, we do that, because they have to take somebody out of the unit otherwise to do that. So we've been backing DOC up a fair amount. And I think you'd hear that if you talk to DOC. We assist Department of Mental Health, of course, DCF. You're going to hear from Sheriff Anderson. I see Sheriff Anderson and Sheriff Marcoux are on the call, but you will hear from them some of the extra work that they are doing. And Sheriff Anderson has a program now where he's supporting DCF with supervising and housing kids before they have an actual placement available. I'll let them talk to you about some of their extra program, because it's really pretty remarkable about the infrastructure that they're supporting. We've been contacted just recently by OCS saying, can you help us serve process on people who are not, we can't find them, people who are not paying child support. Can you help us? I was in the cafeteria, hand to God, this morning having a cup of coffee, and I was approached by DOL, who said, we're looking for help with wage enforcement citations. Can we talk to you about it? And I said, sure, but after this hearing first, let me get.
Yeah, we may not have anybody do that after.
But
Really quickly before we move on, I think there's a question in our judiciary colleagues' room.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, I actually have two questions. Thank you for this overview of it. So my understanding, it sounds like the deputy transport sheriffs are kind of different from the county-based sheriffs that we're talking about. I'm curious, do the deputy transport sheriffs, are they required to be certified law enforcement?
Yes, our job description for the state transport deputies requires them to be certified at level 2 or 3.
That's helpful. Then my other question is, so it sounds like for the county-based sheriffs and deputy sheriffs, that your office funnels the money to them. Like we create it in the budget and then you get it to the county. Is that correct?
No, the only money that passes through our office, our department, is the salary and benefits for the sheriffs themselves, 14 sheriffs, and these 20 state transport deputies.
Okay, but for the county sheriffs, it passes through.
For the sheriff, the 14 sheriffs themselves.
Not the department, for the individual sheriff's salary.
Okay.
Yes, sorry.
So it just makes me, because we were talking about how we can't hold like folks accountable. We can't get rid of somebody if we don't think that, but I'm wondering if there's a monetary piece that we hold of maybe we don't send funding to sheriffs who are not certified. So just putting that out there.
Again, I think that I might be able to touch upon that towards the end, if that's okay.
I also think that would be a good, because next we're going to have Sheriff Mark Anderson and Sheriff Roger Marcoux are coming up next, Representative Dolan. And I think they may be able to talk a little bit more about the way the different sheriff's offices work. And I want to prepare them and maybe flag that it's my understanding that the kinds of contracts and the types of duties that each sheriff's office takes on across the state vary widely from county to county. Would that be a fair?
So like, let's take Franklin County, for instance. If the Franklin County sheriff, gets his salary, but he has to pay for, if he wants his deputies or he wants transport deputies, he pays, and the sheriffs will be able to tell you a little bit more detail, but they have to pay for the cars, they pay for the uniforms, they pay for everything. But where they get their money to do that generally is not, most of them don't just give their salary to do that, but it's either through the contracts they have, or if the assistant judges, if they, in the county budget, if they provide them with any funds. I don't know that from county to county. Again, it's within their office. So if the sheriff did not have funds, unless he wanted to dip into his own salary, it's probably unlikely that he would be hiring deputies or buying cars, what have you. And also, just if while I'm on that, is to let you know that also when a sheriff, the one thing that happens when a sheriff, this goes back to law enforcement powers, once if a sheriff is currently indicted or if been charged with a crime, they lose their ability to access our VCIC, which is a Vermont Crime Institute, so they're really limited as far as what they can do from a law enforcement standpoint. And that's probably a question, more posed to the council or to Jeff Whelan at the VCIC.
Okay, thank you.
I have a couple hands in here. Is there anybody else in House Judiciary before I come back into Gov.Ops with a couple questions?
No, we're good. Thank you.
Okay, great. So Representative Cooper and then Representative Byron.
Clarify, John. is it the sheriff that loses that access or is it the sheriff's office?
The sheriff loses the access. And if there was a deputy, that is a question that I think I know where you're going with that, and I will get an answer for you on that as far as, so if they have deputies, if he just has deputies get access. So, but Annie, I think had some other.
Are there more questions?
Yes.
Representative Byron.
So we've established the fact that they can be removed from sort of all of their accreditation, their functional capacity to engage in a traditional law enforcement manner. But within the structure of the organization of the department, they're still the boss, right? They can still help dictate what tasks or investigations may or may not occur.
Yes, and again, you're looking at that with all, with elected officials. It's not the first time we've had elected officials that have committed what many of us would think is either a criminal act or something that certainly does not let them be fit for office. And as the Ledge Council had mentioned to you, unfortunately, right now, you look at the sole remedy is for the actual taking them out of office is impeachment, and it is a arduous process, and which I think most of you know now, but it is one that can be initiated, and certainly probably faster than 4 years. So.
Thank you for taking the questions. Annie, go ahead.
Sure. So one of the things, John just started to mention it about the 5%. I know that that's been a question as to how that all works. So I do want to say that the sheriff's departments are set up in this very odd structure where it was created to be both, to take in money, public money and private money. So the public money is basically the general fund money that comes through us to support the sheriff's salary and benefits, plus the transport deputies. The county, the provisions around what the county can support, it can support the sheriff's offices in so far as rent, administrative support, so, their bookkeeper, their chief administrative person, some supplies, some phones. You can check with the two sheriffs, Sheriff Marcoux and Anderson, but it doesn't, as far as I know, the county money is not paying for their own deputies. Let me call them their own deputies as opposed to the state transport deputies. But so the money so the structure that was set up basically tells them, go out and find contracts, go out and do those contracts. And for that, you can keep 5% of the contract money. Now, from that money, they buy their cars, they buy their uniforms, they pay the people who are on the contracts, they assume the general liability, the worker comp liability. There's a lot of stuff that is involved with what is coming in on the contract for that. And, I just want to point out, for I know people here have, are involved in state government and nonprofit world. It's not unlike when you see a state agency charging a federal government what they call the indirect cost rate. Most people know I worked as commissioner at labor for 6 years, and we had federal funding, 92% federal funding. And a lot of the money streams that were coming in had indirect cost rates associated with that. And the point of that was paying for the staff that was assigned to that project, but it was also paying part of the commissioner's salary, part of the general counsel's salary, perhaps the director of the program for which it was coming in, because we were responsible to make sure it was staffed. We were responsible for the oversight of the contract, the performance measures, the reporting measures, all of that stuff. So, it seems like, well, why do they get that? Well, so there is that money that comes. Perhaps one of the conversation points that I think both sheriffs agree with is, maybe there needs to be, I've called it bumpers, parameters around the 5%. Like, so how much can you use? What is it used for? I think the sheriffs themselves would adopt a policy talking about that very specifically. And I think that that's one of the things I know that Doug Hoffer and I talk a fair amount about, is kind of building better best practices around operations and money and fiscal things. So I do want to.
Could I just ask a clarifying question though? So my understanding is that other than the sheriff's salary itself and the money for the state transport deputies, the sheriff's really in charge of their budget.
They are.
There's very little outside oversight except for an audit every 2 years.
So that's correct. Exactly what you said. But I do think that the sheriffs understand and are interested in looking at doing more things uniformly, and perhaps adopting practices that will assure citizens of Vermont that they are working diligently and professionally. So I do think that those kinds of suggestions will be coming forward to the committees to take a look at that.
And I think, you have to look at it. Let's, go straight at it. It's the fact that there have been people in the job, position of sheriff that have done things that, just as my personal opinion, that never should have been done. And there are some that they are now being charged, or they're now being having to deal with that in other ways. Some of them have left office. So the question is, we have some bad actors. Do you go ahead and get rid of the whole system as a result of that? Now, again, this is not within my department, so I'm just kind of giving you my personal. I know the jobs that they do for the state, for where they have a contract, where they do the 5%. I know that the work that they do for AHS and specifically DCF, and handling some of the out of control youth that we have sometimes, because you need to have people that are there to help them when they're going through a mental health crisis. The homeless situation is a perfect example. Like during COVID, if it wasn't for Sheriff Marcoux and Sheriff Anderson and a couple of the other sheriffs there, that would not have worked, because they were providing security 24/7 at these places. And, that's something that you can't just go out and hire, or they had Wackenhut guards or whatever. They're just not going to, it would cost a fortune. So there are a lot of good things that come out of their ability to man or staff up to do these contracts. And without the 5%, obviously they're not going to, I doubt they're going to go into their own personal salaries to do it. So I would just, when you're discussing this, and when you're during your inquiries, if you could talk to the sheriffs and find out more about what they do. So this is not defending the actions of some of these other sheriffs that we're here about, or that we know have done things that have been questionable. They don't belong in law enforcement. They don't belong as part of any type of state government, in my mind. But I think we just have to be careful and realize that there are some really good people out there that have been helping and have been very dedicated to making, the state not only a safer place, but also assisting in areas that nobody ever wants to do.
So I know there's a question in judiciary. I'll make time for one or two here, and then I'd like to invite the sheriffs to follow up on that. I think we've done a couple of good segues here. So over in House Judiciary, take it away, Representative Lowland.
Sure, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Campbell, for acknowledging that. Like, I think that is the piece we want to work on, is, keeping our sheriffs at the highest level possible and continuing the good work of them. And so that's why I continue to get stuck on the certification, decertification piece. And I think when we had legislative counsel here, they did mention that for our sheriffs, if they are decertified, there is a lower amount that we pay. Is that correct? Can you confirm that?
No, I think what they may be referring to is if the certification, and this can be confirmed by Sheriff Marcoux, is that if they're not level 3 certified, their salary is 10% less than what a regular fully certified sheriff would be.
That's correct.
Okay, and that's the only difference, so it doesn't go down at all anymore. Okay, thank you, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I feel like that's something we could look into, and I'll follow up with the sheriffs.
Yeah, we could do that.
We're good.
Representative Hango. Oh, sorry. Did you have other questions in judiciary?
No, we're all set. Thank you.
Okay, great. Representative Hango.
Thank you. I'll hold until the sheriffs come to the.
Great. Representative Morgan.
Just real quick, folks. Majority of the area represents Grand Isle County. No law enforcement, any of the 5 communities there, no local policing entities. Vermont State Police, I believe, would be charged with overarching component of that, correct? But the sheriff there, they do a lot of that under contract with those towns. Correct. So is that the same subset of 5% apply? It's that same type of component, or that they would retain, and then the balance of that then goes, I guess that's another piece. Where does that balance reside? Did I miss that?
So for Grand Isle, like Sheriff Allen.
Yes.
We pay his salary and benefits. He
Right.
does not have any state transport deputies, so that's all the
Right.
money that passes through us for him. He does contracts for general law enforcement duties and patrol and general security. I think if there was a homicide or something, the state police would come up and support. So sort of the big critical cases. And I don't, so that money, whatever contract Sheriff Allen has, that money is basically in his sheriff department budget, paying for some of his other non-state deputies
Gotcha.
and his administrative staff.
That's right.
Yeah, although the county may be assisting him with some of the administrative support for, but very small amounts.
Yeah.
And the cars and things that they buy, let's say if they buy cars, that becomes property of the department. That's not property of the sheriffs themselves. So their cars are owned by that sheriff's department.
Okay, I understood it correctly. I just wanted to make sure. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Representative Murwicki and then Representative Hango, and then I would like to move on to hear from the sheriffs.
Kick us out. Logistical piece here. Thank you for your testimony, and there's a lot put out there. As a visual learner, it would be helpful. Do you have written testimony that we can put for the
I
record?
have some notes I'll put into a memo for you.
Okay, is that
for the
possible?
committee?
I would be happy to get a memo from Ms. Noonan. Yes.
Thank you.
We'll circulate that. Representative Hango.
Thank you. Just really briefly, so if a sheriff loses contracts, obviously their revenue goes away, a lot of it. So they're curtailed as to what they actually can perform for law enforcement in that county. Okay, thank you.
Byron, last word.
Yeah, last word. I think I actually know the answer to this, but just clarify. So the loss of the class 3 certification, et cetera, results in a salary reduction. Now, that essentially would render them house cats. So with that extra administrative capacity, could they not source more contracts because they get the ability to take a portion of the contract, correct, as the sheriff? They're allowed to do that?
In terms of, could they take some of the 5% to supplement the 10% reduction?
That's what I'm saying.
Yes,
So if they're like stuck in the office all day, they can just chase more contracts and make up for the
They
difference. In theory, correct? Okay, so it's kind of a theoretical lost income, but could be made up in another way.
At least in my tenure with the department, I've never seen anybody lose a certification at this point.
Sure.
Usually it's as they're coming in the door, we have to assess with Criminal Justice Training Council, we determine whether or not they are level 2 or 3 certified. And that's when their salary is set. And that's their salary by statute. And that's actually a statutory provision that says if they're not level 3, it's a 10% reduction in their salary.
Yes, but if they lose that level 3, they lose the 10%, they could just pursue more contracts and make up that difference in theory, correct?
I would think if they lose level, I don't, this is probably for Criminal Justice Training Council, but I assume that if they were in some way decertified, losing level 3 would also level 2. So yes, they would they would be reduced by our department, but then, but then they could make that up, correct?
We will be speaking with the Vermont Criminal Justice Council, not today, unfortunately, because lose your 5% that they're having today, but we will have to talk about how that works. That's right. That was semantic. So that's fine. I just wanted to flag for everyone that we.
I'd love to ask Andy something.
In judiciary, was there a question?
Yes, one more question, please. Go ahead, Barbara.
So this is for Annie, which I've been thinking about your testimony, and the rest of state government, and you mentioned nonprofits, have when they're using general funds or federal money or probably other state money, but let's just talk about general funds and federal money. So there are requirements to put in other income. For example, any nonprofit that goes through the state rate setting process has to put down other income they're getting. So if it's a United Way grant, if doesn't matter, fee for service, whatever it is, that's going on the same sheet that the state is looking at all the expenses and deducting that applied income from the expenses. Indirect, there's the allowance for indirect rate, like you said, which makes sense. But I'm just wondering why, maybe this is for the chair, why do we not have consistent rules across state government for sort of the accounting part of when do we look at other income that comes in and how that's being spent.
So the state auditor's audit of every other year, and then or when a sheriff leaves office for any reason, there's an audit done of the books. That is an audit of the sheriff's private side of the business, so to speak, right? Or actually in whole, but it's a deep dive into all of the sheriff's other business, what's coming in. So it's an audit, and then in between year, it's a compliance review, and then an audit again. So there's a fair amount of review. Now, the state auditor contracts with an auditing firm. Doug Hofford does not do it himself. He contracts, right now it's with McSorley as an auditor. They've been doing this sheriff's audits for quite a number of years. They're very familiar with the setup and the operations of the sheriff. So I do think that that information is available. It might be good to have the auditors show you what is produced in a sheriff's audit when they're doing the full audit, what information they are looking at and what they're collecting. So it can be
after the fact. That's after the fact, not in budget approval.
Representative Rachelson, we'll be hearing from the auditor and talk a little.
Thank you.
And the sheriffs who are about to testify may have more to say about this as well.
Thank you.
Annie and John, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Next we have two sheriffs, Sheriff Mark Anderson, who is the president of the Vermont Sheriff's Association, and Lamoille County Sheriff Roger Marcoux. Thank you both so much for joining us. I know we're scheduling tight against your being sworn in again today, I think. So I really, really appreciate your time. And if you'd like to, I believe you want to testify jointly. So sorry if I set that up wrong.
Morning.
Not a problem.
I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to do this over Zoom jointly because we're usually looking at each other, whether you take this one and I'll take that one. But Mark, I defer to you as the president.
Great. Chair McCarthy and Chair Lalonde, members of the Joint Committee, thank you for the time. For the record, I am Mark Anderson. I'm the Windham County Sheriff and President of the Vermont Sheriff's Association. I guess, Mr. Chairs, would you mind if I go through and kind of clear the table of the questions that have come up and some of our responses before we start our testimony? I think it might help to provide clarity.
Yeah, I will allow you the time, and thank you for doing that. I think a lot of things have come up that you might want to weigh in on.
Great. So I made a list and I paraphrased, so forgive me if I misunderstood a question or I'm answering the wrong thing. Representative Chase, you had a question regarding if an imprisoned sheriff can remain the sheriff. In title, yes. However, there is a statute. It's 24 VSA 294, which identifies the suspension of the sheriff from their functions. And so this is where the high bailiff's functions would be brought in. And basically, for all intents and purposes, the office of the sheriff, the functions of the sheriff are exercised through the high bailiff, whereas the sheriff is a human with a title, and that's about it, sitting inside their jail cell. Representative Bayrong, you had a question regarding how other states deal with this. First, I think we need to note that other states, usually out west and down south, have stronger forms of county government. So we're somewhat unique in New England and how other states deal with it. But generally speaking, just very short answers, recall elections, county commissioners or supervisors can suspend and or remove. And I think to Representative Hooper's questions about whether or not the towns could vote to this. I mean, this might be areas we want to explore with discussion around the Constitution and what can be done with elected officers. We do have testimony we could offer on that in the future, but just broadly, I think those are opportunities we could discuss. Representative Bayrong, you mentioned or a question of whether the sheriff is still the boss. Yes, and there's some significant complications as the boss when you are convicted of a crime. We have relationships. We, law enforcement agencies statewide, have relationships with the Department of Justice. There's rules that are required by federal mandate. There's laws about carrying firearms. So there's a variety of things that by nature of federal process and state process, we start to lose access to as we fall into those circumstances. The FBI requires a set of rules for who can have access to what's called criminal justice information. And so just by nature of falling into a variety of circumstances, there are administrative penalties that can impact the ability for the sheriff himself or even the agency itself to have access to critical resources that we generally rely on. With regards to the 10% reduction in salary, that is accurate. A level 3 officer or certified officer receives compensation under Title 32. A reduction of that by 10%. What the intent, my understanding, the intent of that is to encourage a higher level of certification. So while I think right now we're looking at this as, is there an opportunity for punitive action based on the reduction of salary? That wasn't necessarily the intent when that permissive was created. So to follow up on whether the sheriff would have more time to take in more contracts, I have not been on the road patrolling since I took office. I've stopped a couple cars, but the administrative responsibilities of my office are far too great for me to be able to regularly investigate cases or anything. So even if I were decertified today, I don't think I would have the additional bandwidth to be able to go seek more contracts. And so, well, I certainly acknowledge the plausibility that you suggest that they could add capacity through the acceptance of money from the 5%. I also think that to a degree, there's not just contracts hanging out there that we can say, well, we have more. When we're looking at contracts, we also have to look at the infrastructure and resources. So vehicles, employees, training, and I just don't think that we would be squeezing more out with a reduction in that 10%. I'm going to skip over a few questions from representatives because I believe it was answered by legal counsel or others. Representative Dolan, you had questions about what other duties the sheriff had if they were decertified. The sheriff is required to serve process. So if somebody doesn't pay their credit card, the credit card company sues them through the civil court. We're the ones who deliver the mail, if you will. So that process would still continue without certification. You've heard from Annie about the state transport deputies. So those functions would still continue. And again, the administrative functions would be there. But generally speaking, the law enforcement functions would cease. Representative Dolan, you had a question about the relationship of the Department of State's attorneys and sheriffs to the county sheriffs. And Representative Maricki, I appreciate the visual learner. So I actually created in PowerPoint an example of what this will look like, and I will submit it to the committee assistants if you'd like to see it, of how funding works for sheriff's offices. This is part of my testimony. But briefly, since the question was asked, there's 3 sources of funding. The state has a source of funding. And when we talk about these sources of fundings, it's good to note what the state does provide and doesn't provide. So in short, it provides the salaries, but it doesn't provide the clothing. It doesn't provide the car. It doesn't provide the law enforcement liability insurance. It doesn't provide legal counsel and representation or human resource management. I mean, there's a variety of things that we do not receive. And so that's 1/3 of a pie chart. Other third of a pie chart is what the county budget provides, and that's limited under a Supreme Court ruling. And so broadly, the counties do provide a building, an office for the sheriff, and they pay for the repairs, telephone service, insurance for the property, and secretarial and bookkeeping assistance. but it doesn't pay any of the deputy sheriff salaries. It doesn't pay for dispatchers or communications salaries, radio or infrastructure, vehicles. Again, law enforcement liability insurance, automobile insurance, unemployment insurance, retirement, healthcare, and the list goes on. Which is where we come to the third portion of funding, which is the department's funds. The department is its own legal entity. The department is able to enter into contracts, and so it's the department that's the ownership of the funds, the assets, and the resources. To that point, is there a way to have monetary control? Yes, that already exists in statute, and we've seen a couple renditions, I believe, as we continue through this discussion around S-17, the constitutional amendment, and any testimony we offer to your committee. We have ideas of ways that we could provide reforms that utilize some of the things that we're talking about here that are already constructs of statute that I think would generally be accepted by the sheriffs who are doing the good work in the state. Representative McCarthy, I believe all of your comments or issues were already answered. Representative Hango, so other states, I can provide a document from the National Sheriff's Association that discuss broadly how other states do handle this. And that also goes on to the differences around the country for appointed versus elected and how those work, why certain systems are better or not better. So I'm happy to provide that as well. Generally speaking, a decertified sheriff would not be able to oversee a criminal investigation. There's just no functional ability to do that. And I would suspect a state's attorney wouldn't accept prosecution if we were the oversight authority of a criminal investigation. Similar to how Executive Director Campbell mentioned that non-attorney state's attorney wouldn't really be able to supervise a licensed deputy state's attorney. Representative Hooper, the discussion around losing access to state services, Executive Director Campbell mentioned losing access to VCIC. That's part of the relationship that agencies have with the Department of Justice, with the FBI, in terms of access to resources. So certainly there are constructs that we can do. Representative Nouget, you asked if we could shorten the term. Certainly through the constitutional amendment, that would be possible. Though I would submit that having stability across a period of time helps lay out a vision. And so as we look at bad actors, there's certainly a desire for us to have removal of bad actors when they occur, but we could also destabilize the good actors as we consider shorter terms. Representative Morgan, you asked where the balance of the 5% goes. It returns, it really never leaves the department. If the sheriff collects anything from the 5%, it goes to the sheriff, obviously. If the sheriff does not collect the 5%, it is invested in the department. An example I use of a way my department just utilized a portion of this was to repair a faulty HVAC unit in our building because that wasn't part of the county budget in this cycle. And well, it's winter and we needed heat. So some of that funds offsets those things. And then Representative Rachelson, you asked a really great question around consistent rules across state government for accounting. And I would submit, I agree. And I think that will be part of our testimony. Based on those questions and my responses, is there anything I could clarify or fill in before I continue with my testimony?
I think I'd prefer that you go ahead with your testimony, Sheriff Anderson, and then we'll save our questions for the end.
Great. So and just to be clear, Mr. Chair, I'm not testifying to S-17. This is just broadly the sheriff's.
Yeah, that probably has a long way to go in the Senate before it gets over to us. So I'm I've been treating that as a potential vehicle for us to take up the kind of reforms that you mentioned or other things that we might find that would be appropriate in this larger context.
Great. So you heard from Ledge Council. Sheriffs are an office that originated out of England. They carry with it a lot of common law constructs that create what we do statutorily, the service of civil process, the transportation of prisoners, preservation of peace, and then what I consider to be the quote unquote 80%, all the other things that we do. Much of that is done through contracting because that is the construct for which we have to secure funds. If I mentioned my pie chart before and how the funds work, and so to simplify and visualize this, in some ways, I have naked bodies that are paid for that have no clothes, no equipment, no insurance, nothing. And those are paid for by the state. And so through these contracts and other ways, we are able to put clothes on the body. So we have professional officers. So we have training for those officers. And so those things do occur. The difference between each county and the services they provide are important and unique in a variety of ways. Number one, I'm able to adjust in Windham County to the needs of my community far quicker than any other organization. And that's why we've been able to be a part of some of the immediate change. I go back to when Hurricane Irene happened and we had massive flooding across the state. My department pivoted 20 personnel out of roughly 22, 20 personnel the next day. Other agencies could not move that fast. We were able to respond when the state hospital flooded and emergency rooms started overflowing with mental health patients, and nurses and doctors were beginning to be assaulted in the ERs. We were able to respond in humane ways. And actually, Sheriff Marcoux can probably speak significantly to the ways and the creative ways in which the Lamoille County Sheriff's Office, my sheriff's, or my predecessor, I should say, and other organizations in the state to come up with safe ways that we can have mental health patients who were in the care of emergency rooms at that point because there just were no psychiatric beds. We've identified new ways, and there are bills before the General Assembly with regards to how law enforcement agencies supervise and or transport psychiatric patients. Those are based off of policies and creations of the sheriff's offices in Vermont. The use of soft restraints or no restraints, use of unmarked cars for transports when people are violent, but at the same time is a result of their mental health condition. My office contracts for law enforcement services with about 15 different communities, whereas the difference in Chittenden County is that most of the towns in Chittenden County have a law enforcement agency such as a police department, and so there's not as much of a need for the sheriff to provide contracting for law enforcement services. Difference in Chittenden County is that the Chittenden County Sheriff has about 100,000 more people for which civil process needs to be served. The Northeast Kingdom has some unique needs for law enforcement in that some of their traffic is seasonal, which creates increase in summer or winter activity and decreases in opposite seasons. So the needs for law enforcement services are sometimes it's only the sheriff who's capable of providing that. The Essex County Sheriff receives funds from the state of Vermont to provide policing because the state police do not provide any patrols there. Grand Isle, as I believe, was mentioned by Representative Morgan, the sheriff is providing a majority of the services to Grand Isle, and while he can access the state police, generally speaking, the sheriff who provides those services. There's a variety of agencies around the state, sheriff's departments around the state that provide regional dispatching, but not all of them do. And so in that case, I know that regional dispatch is a topic for discussion this year. Sheriff Marcoux has a 24/7 dispatch center, which I believe Senate Gov.Ops is going to be doing a field trip to. Certainly I don't know if there's interest for field trips from House Judiciary or House Government Operations and Military Affairs, but I would certainly extend a field trip to my office if you'd like to see our regional dispatch. I'm also willing to do a virtual tour so that you don't have to take a 2-hour drive if that's not in the cards. I don't want to speak for.
I do believe, to your question, that we are trying to work out a tour to Sheriff Marcoux's dispatch with our Senate colleagues.
Regional dispatch is something that is already served. Sheriff Marcoux can talk about what his department does. My department currently dispatches for 3 agencies, and we monitor communications for 4th, EMS and law enforcement agencies. We have a lot of support to the Agency of Human Services. So you heard Annie speak about supporting the Department of Corrections. We are using our staff to help not only support Department of Corrections in moving prisoners from facility to facility due to their current staffing challenges. We're also supporting the movement of males and females around the state. We're trying to coordinate it so it's efficient. We're supporting the Department of Children and Families. Annie alluded to a program that my department created. The basic problem statement that we were looking at is that children entering the Commissioner of Children and Families custody because they are violent, they are a risk to themselves or others. They're entering the Commissioner's custody, but there's no beds for them. This ties broadly into the conversation about Newberry, about Woodside, and a variety of other programs. And the reality is that what we are seeing happen is that these children are ending up in the emergency room waiting for placement, or they're ending up in the conference room of a police department. So understanding the construct that they're ending up in these not ideal places and there's nowhere for them to go and they're harmful to others. Social workers are concerned for their own safety based on history of assaults and homicide to DCF workers. There's concerns for safety and security. So what we created at my department here in Brattleboro was what we call the Rest Stop. It's a program that's a trauma-informed concept that DCF helped us pull together, where DCF can just access the space. If they need law enforcement services, they can work with my staff to provide the security. But at the same time, we want a social worker who's actually administering the care. They're helping get food, provide the necessary supports to the youth while we continue to wait for their placement. Since November, we've pretty much had a youth in our custody every Friday until the following Monday. And that's just its placement issues with the current contracting model that the state's using. So we also provide support to the Department of Mental Health. Again, patients who require secure transport. This means that they do not meet criteria to be transported in an ambulance, which would probably be an ideal method of transport for a medical patient, including a person undergoing psychiatric care. But because of a risk to themselves or others, they sometimes require secure transport. So this is where we've engineered systems to use soft restraints, no restraints, but again, in a trauma-informed way to help a mental health, a person experiencing a mental health issue be able to get the care they need without a stigma that they've created some or performed some criminal act that they really haven't. I can dive into the weeds on a lot of these things, but really, I think I come before these committees to say that as a sheriff, as a person who joined the sheriff's department in 2004, I saw the trauma and the effects of what happens when a sheriff has misconduct. Just by way of history, the sheriff who hired and commissioned me was ultimately charged and convicted of a variety of crimes, including embezzlement. There's history there I won't get into unless you'd like me to. But that said, I saw the damage that occurs. I care passionately about this issue. I believe that there's ways that we can work to improve the system. Some of these are discussions we've had for 15 years. Some of these are discussions that are coming up in the last 6 or 7 months based on new issues that have been identified. I try to be an open book, and so I come before you to say let's make meaningful change. And I've been warmly welcomed by the chair of government operations in both the Senate and the House. I appreciate the opportunity to communicate with you openly, and I think we can come up with ways for meaningful change that doesn't damage the good work that's happening today.
So Sheriff Anderson, you've painted a picture of a whole variety of ways that our communities, state agencies really depend on the sheriff's offices. And I know that when you and I have spoken that there's an acknowledgement that there needs to be some greater change because some of your colleagues in the past, I think even your predecessor, there have been issues that we might not be equipped with current constitutional structure and the law. And I just want to say that I really appreciate your openness to be a partner in some of that change. And I'm going to open things up to a couple of questions before we go to Sheriff Marcoux. But I very much just want to say that I respect and appreciate the collaborative approach that you've taken in your testimony in the Senate and here today. Are there folks that have any clarifying questions or
that was a good overview.
I think that Sheriff Anderson did a really good job to go through all of the questions that had come up to date. So I appreciate that so much. Anybody over in Judiciary have any questions for Sheriff Anderson before we go to Sheriff Marcoux?
I don't see any. Or, no, we do. Representative Chapin.
Yes, Sheriff, thank you so much for your testimony. I am just curious to hear a little bit more detail about what it is. I mean, I think I have a sense, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about what it is about the sheriff's organization and how they're constructed right now that make that response in times of great need in the community so effective.
Simply put, I mean, there's been some discussion about how the sheriff is responsible for their budget. Well, that's also what gives us the ability to say this is within the scope of what we believe we should do, and so we can engage. I don't need to go before a board of commissioners or supervisors or select board to say I need approval for us to buy a car because my car just got wrecked, which last week one of my cars just got wrecked and now I'm down a car. So we're able to navigate through that, and that's within the realm of the Uniform Accounting Manual published by the State Auditor's Office. But we can make common sense decisions very quickly without a lot of red tape.
Thanks.
So I would like to hear Sheriff Marcoux's comments, and then we're going to take a quick bio break before hearing from folks from the courts themselves. I almost said the judiciary, and I don't want to get confused between the House Judiciary Committee and our Superior Court judge and administrator. So that's just to set the agenda here. We'll take a quick break because we've been going for a while. But Sheriff Marcoux, I want to hear from you first, so I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Roger Marcoux, and I'm the Lamoille County Sheriff. And I just want to comment on Sheriff Anderson's excellent and very articulate testimony here. We're lucky to have him as our leader, and he's one of the young sheriffs that we have that we need more like him. And in echoing what he said, I'm very dismayed as to what's occurred in this state. And I've been here today will be my 22nd year, the start of my 22nd year as sheriff. And I've got 42 years in law enforcement. What the sheriffs need is structure. They need to be accountable. And we need a mechanism to constantly have that oversight. And so Sheriff Anderson and I believe that what we're trying to do here with your help and with our colleagues or our representatives in the Senate is to reform the sheriffs. I'll tell you a little bit about my operation and because I've had the great fortune of having support from my community. And what is the sheriff's greatest strength is also our greatest weakness. And that's the ability to act unilaterally on issues. I was appointed by Governor Dean in 2001. And I had been, at the time, I had been working in the field of human rights and specifically investigating extrajudicial murders in the country of Haiti for 5 years. And when the inquiries as to my interest into taking over for Sheriff of Lamoille County started, my concern at the time was exactly what we're seeing. I had been in municipal police work for quite a few years, and I'd seen the good and the bad and the ugly with Vermont sheriffs. So I made the decision to give it a try, and decided that, look, I'm going to try to be the best professional I can be. And we built the department up. It was already a good department, and you know, we were leaders in things like regional dispatch way back then, you know, 20 years ago. Actually, the regional dispatch, which included the 911 call taking, started in 1975. So, and we've been going strong ever since, with communities paying into that. We have a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week police department, so to speak, made of deputies that work for three towns, Hyde Park, Johnson, and Wolcott. And every year we meet with those people, the leadership, and see what's going right and what's going wrong, and they ratify our contracts. So my philosophy is that you know, when you're looking for contracts, it's about customer service. If the customers are not happy, then they're not going to contract with us. And for the past several years, our payroll has paid out to employees here over $2 million a year. So we've had great luck in some initiatives. I'm kind of Mark is a detail guy. I'm more like the artist with the big broader picture. And sometimes, fortunately, I have people around me that keep me on the straight path with details. But we here, given the latitude that we have, we were able to work with the Department of Mental Health. And this was in concert with Sheriff Anderson's predecessor down in Wyndham, but where there was a problem where the department was complaining, and it was the commissioner of mental health at the time, and Senator Westman was in the House at the time, about law enforcement was unwilling statewide to transport people in mental health crisis with no violence in their background. They were unwilling to transport them without restraints, or at the very least with soft restraints. So, and that didn't seem right. And a sheriff has the latitude to make policy. And we created a policy. We worked with the Department of Mental Health, and we came up with a training scenario where we transported people without handcuffs when they didn't have any violence in their background. We transport them in plain clothes, in a soccer van, you know, a minivan, and where they were not, you know, they might go to their dentist that they'd seen ever since they were young, and so it was a dignified, humane way of dealing with a situation that sheriff's departments were able to do because we were able to act quickly. We've had the good fortune here of having enough good business luck through the years to buy a property across the street from the sheriff's department, and we made a homeless shelter and worked in concert with the interfaith community here in our county, and now it's got its own governance, but first homeless shelter in the county. And I'm very, very proud of that. It'll be one of the things when I retire that I think more of than all the arrests that I've ever made. Department of Health had an issue where they wanted drugs picked up more than once every 6 months through the federal DEA drug take-back program. So we developed, based on my experience with 12 years in the DEA, we developed a situation where, or a system where we work in concert with the municipalities and the Vermont State Police. And our department goes once a month or as required to each county to pick up drugs and then inventory them and store them. And then again, work with the DEA to get them out of state every 6 months. So given the opportunity, the point of all of this is in how great I am. Given the opportunity, a good functioning sheriff's department can really serve the community. And again, I have no problems, and Sheriff Anderson has no problems with continuing to professionalize our group, pay us on par with other state law enforcement folks, and then develop some structure, maybe beef up the state's attorneys and sheriffs, which we can do without adding any money, I believe, to have a component just dealing strictly with the sheriffs, particularly whenever our executive director and Annie decide to retire down the road, which scares the heck out of me. Lastly, I'll just talk about the 5%. 5%, there's always, it's an easy target for the media. 5% enriching sheriffs, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what does that mean? For me, I probably, bring in the most money out of any of the sheriff's departments. For me, last year, if you take what I made as paid by the state and took the 5% that I took, it equaled the middle major in the Vermont State Police. So there's not like $500,000 that we're paying ourselves or what have you here. I think it's certainly reasonable to either get a more bump us up to where executives in the Vermont State Police are, or cap the 5%. We're not going to fight anybody on that down the road, but I do believe that we should be paid equally as well as other folks, and this is going to help attract. Hopefully, this will help attract the most professional candidates for office that we can have. We have a lot of responsibility, a lot of liability. We have to hire our own lawyers if there's a lawsuit, and so that more on that later if there are questions on it down the road. So that's basically what I have. It's just to let the committee know that we want to get this thing worked out and once and for all. And I think it's going to take some time because it's a very complicated issue. But if you, for example, alter what we can do now to include taking away our ability to contract, which the 5% is going to make it difficult if that goes away for some sheriff's departments to contract. There's a lot of different agencies that are going to be heard out there. Last Friday, I met with Colonel Birmingham, who told me that he is willing to testify as to the effects of diminishing ability for sheriffs to work, what those effects would have on the Vermont State Police. I think if you call in members of the Agency of Human Services, you'd see the same thing. You're going to hear from the courts. I talked to Judge Zone last week about this.
So we're going to talk to him next. And I don't want to cut you off, Sheriff Marcoux, but I need to give our committees a break. And so I just want to ask if anybody has any really pressing questions, knowing that we are going to have the Sheriff's Association, and I will invite Sheriff Anderson and Sheriff Marcoux back, especially if we're talking about any specific bill language. Are there any really urgent questions that we need to get out today?
Oh, great overview.
Right. So unless I hear differently from our folks, I believe Vice Chair Burdett is chairing in judiciary for the moment. We're going to take a very brief break. So I want to give folks a chance, and we'll be back here and start at 11 sharp.